You're watching someone struggle to maintain a version of themselves that's becoming harder to sustain. Not because they're being exposed, but because time is doing what time always does. It makes performance exhausting. And whatever someone truly is, whatever patterns run deepest, those things eventually surface, not through dramatic revelation, through erosion, through the slow wearing down of the energy required to be something you're not. And what you're witnessing now, this shift you're noticing, it's not new behavior. It's original behavior, the behavior that was always there but suppressed under the weight of impression management, of social performance, of the early stage effort required to secure commitment. And now that commitment is secured, or age has reduced the stakes, or exhaustion has eliminated the capacity to keep performing, you're seeing what was underneath the whole time. Not a transformation, an unmasking. Here's what most people misunderstand about human nature. It's not fixed, but it's not infinitely malleable either. People can grow, people can change, people can develop new patterns and break old ones. But that requires conscious work, sustained effort, genuine desire to be different. And most people aren't doing that work. Most people are just managing how they're perceived. They're performing the version of themselves that gets them what they want. And that performance works. For a while. During courtship, during the phase where there's something to gain by being agreeable, pleasant, accommodating, self-aware. But performance is exhausting. And eventually one of two things happens. Either the person does the internal work to make those performed traits genuine, or they stop performing and revert to baseline. And baseline is who they are when no one's watching, when there's no incentive to impress, when the cost of maintaining the performance exceeds the benefit it provides. Think about the specific things you're noticing. Maybe it's entitlement that's becoming more obvious, a belief that the world owes her something, that people exist to serve her needs, that inconvenience is personally offensive. Maybe it's cruelty that's emerging, a willingness to hurt people who can't retaliate, a pleasure in having power over others, a lack of empathy that was always there but hidden under polite behavior. Maybe it's selfishness that's intensifying, an inability to consider others unless it directly benefits her, a transactional view of all relationships, a constant calculation of what she's getting versus what she's giving. Or maybe it's chaos, an inability to maintain stability, a pattern of creating drama because calm feels like stagnation, a need for constant external stimulation because internal peace was never developed. Whatever the specific manifestation, what you're seeing is consistent. The gap between who she presented herself as and who she actually is closing. And that gap is closing not because she's changing, but because she's stopped hiding. Here's the mechanism at work. We all curate ourselves. We all present edited versions. We emphasize traits that make us appealing and suppress traits that don't. And that's not inherently dishonest. That's social functioning. But there's a difference between emphasizing your better qualities and pretending qualities you don't have exist. And the second one, that's what becomes unsustainable. Because you can emphasize patience you actually possess, but you can't indefinitely perform patience you don't have. You can highlight kindness that's genuinely part of you, but you can't fake kindness forever if cruelty is your baseline. And what happens over time, what happens as the relationship ages, or as her circumstances change, or as the perceived need to maintain the performance decreases, is the gap between performance and reality becomes too exhausting to maintain. And the performance drops, not all at once, but gradually. And what's left is who she actually is when she's not trying. And here's the part that's hard to accept. You probably saw signs, early signs, small moments where the mask slipped, where something came out that didn't match the overall presentation, where you noticed something off but talked yourself out of it because everything else seemed good, where you caught a glimpse of cruelty or entitlement or chaos, but explained it away as stress or circumstance or one bad moment. And now looking back, you realize those weren't aberrations. They were glimpses of what was always there. They were the truth leaking through the performance. And you ignored them because you wanted to believe the performance was real. Because the performed version was what you were falling for, and acknowledging that underneath was something else would have meant walking away from something that felt good. So you didn't. You stayed. And now the performance is failing, and you're dealing with the reality that was always underneath. Here's what this looks like in practice. Someone who was generous becomes calculating. You realize the generosity was never overflow. It was investment. And now that the relationship is established, now that she's secured what she wanted, the generosity stops, because it was always transactional. Someone who seemed easygoing becomes controlling. You realize the accommodation wasn't flexibility, it was strategy, a way to secure commitment without revealing how rigid she actually is. And now that commitment is secured, the rigidity emerges. Someone who was warm becomes cold. You realize the warmth was performance, a tool for attraction, and now that attraction has served its purpose, maintenance doesn't require warmth. It just requires presence, and presence without warmth is what you're getting now. Or maybe it's not even relationship specific. Maybe you're watching someone age into their patterns, watching someone who could mask insecurity with youth and beauty lose those tools and reveal the deep insecurity underneath. Watching someone who could coast on looks and charm hit the age where looks fade and charm isn't enough, and the lack of substance becomes undeniable. Watching someone who could manipulate through tears and helplessness age out of the window where that strategy works and reveal the calculating operator underneath. And this isn't cruelty toward aging. This is observation of what happens when the tools someone used to hide who they are stop working, and they're left with just themselves. And themselves isn't someone they ever developed into something worth being. Here's the pattern you're probably seeing: increased difficulty managing her image. She's working harder to maintain reputation, getting defensive when questioned, reacting disproportionately to perceived slights, needing constant validation, creating narratives where she's always the victim. And what that reveals is someone who knows at some level that the gap between how she wants to be seen and what she actually is has become obvious, and the energy required to maintain that gap is overwhelming her. And instead of doing internal work to actually become the person she's been pretending to be, she's doubling down on performance, getting angry when people don't validate the version she's presenting, cutting off people who see through it, surrounding herself with people who confirm the narrative she needs to believe. And it's not working, because truth has a way of being obvious eventually, and you can't outrun it. You can just exhaust yourself trying. So what do you do with this information? First, you stop making excuses. Stop explaining away what you're seeing. Stop telling yourself it's temporary or stress-related or something you're misunderstanding. Trust your observations. Trust the pattern. Trust that when someone repeatedly shows you who they are through behavior that contradicts their words, the behavior is the truth. Second, you protect yourself. You stop giving someone access to hurt you based on who you hoped they were. You make decisions based on who they've proven themselves to be. You set boundaries based on actual behavior, not stated intentions. You stop investing in the potential of someone who's showing you their reality. Third, you decide what's acceptable, and you act on that decision. If what you're seeing is incompatible with what you need, if the person underneath the performance is someone you wouldn't choose, you make different choices. Not with anger, not with judgment about them being good or bad, just with clarity about compatibility, about whether this is someone you want in your life given who they actually are, rather than who they presented themselves as. And here's the thing about true nature: it's not always ugly. Sometimes what emerges is actually better than the performance. Sometimes people relax into authenticity and become more genuine, more present, more real. Sometimes the dropping of performance reveals depth that was hidden under the effort to appear a certain way. But when what emerges is worse, when the authentic self is less kind, less honest, less stable than the performed self, you have information. And that information is valuable. Not for judgment, but for decision-making. For understanding that who you thought you were dealing with and who you're actually dealing with are different people. And you get to choose which version you engage with. And if the real version isn't someone you'd choose, if the authentic self underneath the performance is someone who doesn't align with your values or your needs or your boundaries, you're not obligated to stay engaged. You're not required to accept the real version just because you invested in the performed version. Here's what you need to understand. Everyone performs to some degree. Everyone curates, everyone emphasizes certain traits and downplays others, but there's a spectrum, and on one end is people who are fundamentally who they present themselves to be, just more polished in presentation. And on the other end is people whose entire presentation is fabrication, whose authentic self bears little resemblance to what they show the world. And when you're involved with someone on that second end, when the gap between presentation and reality is massive, time always reveals it. Always. Because maintaining that gap requires energy, and energy depletes, and eventually the performance fails. And you see what was always underneath, and that's not exposure. That's just exhaustion meeting reality. And what you do with that reality, whether you accept it or walk away from it, that's the only choice you actually have. Because you can't change someone's nature. You can only decide whether their nature is something you want to be around. And that decision doesn't make you judgmental. It makes you honest. And honesty, especially about who people actually are versus who they want you to believe they are, that's the only foundation for making real choices. Choices based on reality, not on hope, not on potential, not on the version they performed during courtship, but on who they actually are when the performance ends. And if that person isn't someone you recognize, isn't someone you choose, isn't someone whose authentic self aligns with what you need, then recognizing that isn't cruel. It's clarity. And clarity is what allows you to make decisions that protect you, that honor you, that acknowledge that you deserve to be around people whose authentic selves are worth being around. Not people whose only value exists in performance. Not people who can only be appealing when they're hiding who they really are, but people whose nature, when revealed, is something you actually want to engage with. And if someone can't offer that, if the dropping of performance reveals someone you wouldn't choose, you're not obligated to stay, you're just obligated to be honest about what you're seeing, and to act accordingly.